The final hour of George Armstrong Custer's life defines the tragedy at the heart of the Little Bighorn Conflict, which is encased in myth and mythology. This was not your typical conflict. Custer's final hour into the tunnel, ABatte Playing Out in the Dark, contains decisions that define the tragedy at the heart of the Little Bighorn Conflict. The conflict between one man's unwavering desire and the entire possibility of a people protecting throughout the years, but the last hour is still a dark hole. What did Custer actually see, often overlooked in popular accounts, his men's fates? This video delves into that tunnel, offering not just a timeline, but also an introspective look at the oppressive heat that hung heavy over the ground, as George Armstrong Custer looked out over the ground, about to experience a pivotal event that would either solidify his reputation as an exceptional way of life or mark a turning point. Historians have pieced together bits and pieces of evidence from the parched countryside. It was 10:05 p.m. on June 25, 1876. Custer was aware that he was whatwashis beginning to the evolving battlefied. Above all, which decisions determine his and in-depth analysis of Custer's most crucial choices, highlighting the subtleties and errors that are leading or cause him to fail? The stakes could not have been higher for Custer. The 7th Cavalry's aim was to defeat a substantial Sioux and Cheyenne New Warrior coalition that had organized against soldiers from the U.S. administration. Every step they took pushed them more into the unknown as they crossed the Rosebud-Little Bighorn divide. Custer made the bold decision that would define his final hours as she surveyed the Rockland landscape. His unit would be divided into 4 distinct battalions. Custer was unaware at the time that his choices would condemn him to the tunnel of history, where rumors and contradicting accounts would permanently obscure the reality of his final hours. This decision has generated a lot of debate among historians, with many arguing that it was a grave mistake that split forces just when they needed to be together. Custer, however, had good reason to think differently, and his scouts had reported seeing signs of an Asizabe hamlet hidden away along the bank of the Little Bighorn River. His approach was clear but aggressive, and Major Reno would command 3 companies in order to catch the enemy's attention. The hamlet was larger than Custer had anticipated, and he could see that the element of surprise was fading. Custer felt that his greatest assets were quickness and courage in the face of overwhelming soldiers. Frontal attack on these settlements from the south. To ensure that no Indian soldiers could flee adamant about leading from the front, Captain Benteen would lead 5 companions to the right and move quickly to the west. Captain McDougall's 1st Battalion would protect the crowded train and act as a backup force. Custer, who was always on the high ground, would lead a battalion in reconnaissance up the ridges to the left. To flank these settlements and prevent any escape to the north, Custer, who had established a reputation for himself by taking chances and frequently outwitting and outthinking his adversaries. He had previously faced Native American forces and had always prevailed due to his aggressive strategy. This battle was different, though, as there were thousands of Lakota, more than Custer had ever encountered in a single battle. Custer was confident that a Cheyenne and Arapaho W warriors in the large village would throw these troops into disarray, and that the key to victory was to split his soldiers. The unit advanced swiftly as the orders were given. Positioned on the left, Reno's brigade quickly advanced down the valley, while on the right, Custer's geographically distant battalion would be operating independently from this point on, responding to a battlefield that was becoming increasingly chaotic. Unaware of the large number of people, the documentary has placed more emphasis on the fact that Custer, Reno, and Benteen were now column-ran parallel to them, but their routes quickly diverged due to the terrain. Even though the physical separation was brief, it marked the end of any coordinated attempt. Each waiting for him, Reno rushed ahead. However, Custer continued to drive his soldiers north while focusing on blocking any move, and Reno's assault were all elements of a time-dependent strategy that were partially known in real time. The ramifications of his choice would become more apparent as his forces moved farther down the valley. Custer's boldness is often highlighted in the documents, but the intricacy. He was weighing the benefits and dangers of striking an adversary whose strength was only of this choice is rarely highlighted. Custer wasn't merely taking chances with his men's lives. It became increasingly evident, however, as the minutes passed, how impossible it would be to coordinate these forces across miles of difficult terrain. At the moment, Custer believed the risk was worthwhile, and he had divided his army in the victory posture. But this time, the outcome would be drastically different. By 1:26 p.m., Custer committed his battalion to the high ground, and the extent of the Indian town below was exposed as soldiers ascended the cliffs that rose above the Little Bighorn Valley. It was a camp of horses, and however, Custer's conviction grew greater. He believed the secret to victory lay in his planto attack from behind while Reno fought in the front. He thought that the teepees that was much bigger than Custer had been, and I ended farther than anyone. The gravity of what he faced became painfully obvious in that moment. Even though the sight should have meant retreating, Gerard's instincts told him to back off. He shouted, "There go your Indians running like devils. This was not a village caught off guard and fleeing in a way." Custer's trustworthy interpreter, Gerard, had been the first to see the enemy activities. He was unaware that his adversary was preparing a counterattack rather than running in fear. Gerard's surgent warning, however, was the first indication that the Custer was unfazed. His battalion would continue to march north along the high road in order to block the Indians' escape route, and Custer believed that by attacking from behind while Reno's soldiers pressed from choosing to reorganize the front, he could surprise the village. He had previously found success with this traditional reaction was prompt, and he had always flourished on taking decisive, audacious action. He hammer and anvist strategy. However, in the midst of this rapidly developing conflict, Custer was unaware of the true strength of the opposition. The terrain itself presented a significant obstacle. The horses fought to keep their feet on the uneven surface, causing the columns to begin to collapse. Understanding why Custer's battle becomes so vulnerable requires knowledge of the formation spread out as Custer's soldiers followed the winding path that ran along this detail, which is frequently left out of conventional combat histories. From where he stood on the ridge, Custer could barely make out glimmers of Reno's army challenging. Reno's battalion was moving toward these settlements below, but he couldn't see through the bluffs because of the men's dispersion, which made communication between the column's lead and rear more difficult. It would be devastating if the two columns were disconnected. Although Custer believed Reno was making progress, Reno's unit was facing fierce opposition and had to quickly deal with it, and the synchronization that was so crucial to Custer's plan was beginning to break down. Custer and Reno did not fully understand the danger that the other was experiencing. The Indians were now preparing for a full-scale assault instead of fleeing. The warriors of Custer's battalion encountered a series of deep ravines or couloirs that crisscrossed the terrain as they advanced farther into the high country. The column was forced into a single file as a result of these inherent barriers, which further hampered their progress. The men were left with seasoned leaders like Crazy Horse and Gall. Unaware that he was marching straight into a trap, Custer persisted in pushing northward, unwavering in his strategy. They were positioning themselves to confront Custer's flanking army directly under the direction of exposed and unprotected by the coulees, which served as funnels. Scouts claimed to have seen small groups of Indians following them around the ridges, using a flanking maneuver rather than fleeing. Custer's troops immediately began to see signs that they were talon in these confined spaces, but they proceeded in their mission to reach the other side of these settlements and finish the battle. The significance of this moment cannot be overstated. Custer's unwavering loyalty to his, but in this particular case, his arrogance would be fatal. At 1:42 p.m., Custer looked down on his own tactical supremacy, which is demonstrated by his decision to suppress the opposition despite mounting evidence, highlighting the fact that his actions were driven by a strong conviction in his ability to outmaneuver the opposition, rather than by recklessness or warnings of danger. This film offers new insight into Custer's leadership psychology by battlefield from his vantage point high above the valley. He found what he saw as troubling. The smoke arising from Indian warriors demonstrated that the situation was even worse than Reno had anticipated. Despite these settlements, the haphazard movement of his forces, and the distant formation of ranks of cautionary indications, Custer was adamant about moving forward. His scouts were providing him with timely updates, but they were vague and lacking in detail, particularly Mitch Boyer and Gerard. The physical interpreted these changes as evidence that Custer's flanking strategy was effective, absent from other battle narratives. Custer should have been alarmed by Boyer's statement that the turnout to be disastrous. One of Custer's Crow scouts, Curley, later described his best experiences serving in the battalion. Custer's scouts' testimonies from these pivotal times offer a distinct viewpoint that is frequently Indians were assembling, and Gerard's observation of the warriors' actions. Instead, the separation between his column and Custer's miscalculation of the battlefield and Reno's wood. From where he was, Curley could see what Custer could not because of the way the landscape was shaped. Already Indian troops were moving to block their path, and the combatants, led by Gall and Crazy Horse, were prepared to fight against Custer's Iron Cedar. A dashing Papaw warrior is said to have spotted small groups of warriors, but Custer was able to recognize that his battalion was isolated and overworked, and that they were about to be threatened. The last small gully before these statements was Medicine Tail Coulee. On the ridges above, scouts are often left out of the popular narrative of the conflict, despite the fact that his actions had a significant influence on Custer's final hours. Iron Cedar rushed back to the town to warn the others after spotting Custer's approach from Custer's battalion, which arrived at Medicine Tail Coulee's base at approximately 2:05 p.m. Weary from the reverberation before they could organize our resistance. Anticipating Custer's his perch atop the ridge, the warriors reacted quickly to stop Custer once the entire tribe from Reno, the village from Gall, now focused on Custer's flanking army. The initial burst of gunfire became aware of his approach after a few minutes. After initially focusing on protecting movements, the Indians launched an overwhelming attack. Instead of rushing blindly, Custer was responding to the facts at this disposal and making adjustments in real time based on the meager information his scouts had given him. This film gives a more nuanced portrayal of Custer's final hours than the frequently reported reckless charge into the unknown. The battlefield was in ruins in a matter of minutes. However, he had few options because of the size of the Indian army, the difficult terrain, and the fact that the land had turned into an adversary on par with the assembling Cheyenne and Sioux battalion that had landed in Medicine Tail Coulee. By the time Custer's Butso did their inability to communicate and the overwhelming power of the force they encountered, their mounting exhaustion as the afternoon sun poured down, creating a disjointed column of soldieres fighting against the terrain and the disarray among its own unit. Custer's overconfidence ultimately proved to be his downfall, warriors. His men's mobility and ability to maintain any kind of cohesive formation were abruptly restricted by the coolies, on whom he had relied for consignment. But at 2:05 p.m., Custer saw the drop into Medicine Tail Coulee's last strategic move, ABatte in the midday sun. To complete the flanking move, he had to cross the river, attempt to outflank the Indian hamlet, and deliver a rushing blow. From there, he could see the Little Bighorn rivers shimmering. His strategy was straightforward but bold, and the Indians were caught in a pincer movement between his unit and Reno's army, as they pushed through the coulee across the river and struck the hamlet from behind. Naturally, this was based on the belief that the Indians were fleeing because of the overwhelming number of Indian warriors. At around 1:45 p.m., Reno had ordered his men to dismount and form a skirmish line, but the warriors under Custer were unaware that Reno's son's attack had already failed. Reno's soldiers had been forced to focus more on fending off the frontal attack, and that Reno was still fighting the village's front. The leadership of Crazy Horse and Gall had launched a counterattack. Reno's regiment was outnumbered and outmaneuvered, and he was able to carry out his flanking strategy because he was high on the bluffs. Eyewitness reports from scouts like Curley and Mitch Boyer provide crucial context for this pivotal event. Both men claim to have seen it, then they attempted a last-ditch stand as Custer's squad swung into the coulee. The terrain concealed this disorderly withdrawal from the move, as he continued to believe that Reno's attack was proceeding according to plan. Both men and horses suffered as a result of the challenging terrain and the afternoon heat. Soldiers and animals were struggling to keep up, as the battalion had slowed to a crawl. Boy in particular noticed the men's growing unease. They had expected to run into Iron Cedar, the handsome Papa Scout, who had previously observed Custer's movements, but instead they saw signs of a prepared defense. As the warriors arrived at the warrior, they could see that Custer's forces were now fully exposed, but he was unable to. Gall and Crazy Horse had already been informed of the presence of the flanking unit by the base of the coulee. This video highlights the fact that, despite being one of the most crucial aspects of the conflict, the fall into Medicine Tail Coulee is often overlooked in conventional narratives. Originally offering tactical advantage and concealment, the coulee now serves as Custer's terrain in determining the men's death fight. Custer had limited options due to the narrow passageways and the growing number of fighters assembling on the ridges. Thanks for watching, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you want to explore more fascinating history, be sure to check out my other video on the Battle of Little Bighorn, where I delve deeper into the events leading up to Custer's last stand.